Now, there's no more important bilateral relationship in the world today than that between China and the United States. And that relationship right now is really not in good shape, except in one area. There is, and that's around cooperation around climate change. So the roundtable today is going to look at what's going on between these two superpowers on the clean energy front. How can the efforts in that space today be accelerated and scaled up in such a way that it really can play a key piece in saving the planet from catastrophic climate change? And could we, in this kind of partnership around battling or fighting global warming, could that actually improve our relations in other spaces, unrelated to climate, but also related to our relationship? In other words, how can we evolve this key relationship in a way that we're working increasingly as allies rather than enemies? Because so much of what happens in the 21st century is going to really depend on how that relationship plays out. Now, I'm Pete Leiden. I'm the founder of Reinvent, and this is among the last of our roundtables in our series, Reinvent American Foreign Policy. We're clearly saving the best for last. This is going to be the 14th of 15. We started way back in September, and we've been kind of moving through all kinds of key areas of American foreign policy, and yet we've saved this critical relationship with China toward the very end here. Now, we're grateful to our partners in this series who have been with us from the beginning, Plowshares Fund, and also 3 key individuals who have actually supported us from the beginning. That's Guy Saperstein, it's Katrina Vanden Heuvel, and Dan Berger. We're also really grateful that we've actually got a terrific person to drive the conversation. We're in very capable hands here with Mark Clifford. Mark is the Executive Director of the Asia Business Council. He's based in Hong Kong, and in fact, he's coming in from Hong Kong right now, and very late in his day or early in his morning, however you want to think about it. We're great to have Mark here. Mark is the author of a relatively new book here, The Greening of Asia, The Business Case for Solving Asia's Environmental Emergency. But he's a long-time kind of Asia hand, China hand, you could say. He was the editor-in-chief of the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong there. He also, before that, was the editor-in-chief of The Standard, based there as well. He also was the Asia regional editor for Business Week, and I knew him way back then in the very beginning as we were both kind of foreign correspondents based in Seoul, South Korea. So I know for a fact we've got a great person to drive this conversation. But besides that, we've also got an incredible panel gathered here for this very important conversation. And I think what we'd like to do here is go around the table and just have each person introduce themselves a little bit. Let's start with Orville Schell, who's the director of the Center on U.S. China Relations at the Asia Society. Orville, do you want to talk a little bit about your very storied background in what you know about China in this topic? You're muted out right now. Yep.
For the last many decades, I've been trying to make sense out of China, both as a writer and then professor and dean at Berkeley. And I would have to say that China has always surprised us. And I think our conversation today is going to touch on one of the more sort of optimistic points in the relationship, a relationship which I think, as we will discover, is quite strained at the present moment, as you've suggested.
Terrific. It's great to have you coming in from New York. Next, we've got Isabel Hilton, the CEO and editor of China Dialogue, but she also has a long history in this issue. Isabel, give us a little more on where you're coming from.
Hello, everyone. I also have a background in China. I studied Chinese very early on, an early adopter, and I studied in China at the tail end of the Cultural Revolution, actually, for a couple of years, and then became a journalist. And 10 years ago, I set up a bilingual Chinese-English website on climate and environment called China Dialogue, with the idea partly of improving what was the dialogue of the deaf at the time, you know, kind of full of mutual recrimination, trying to get past that and publishing in both directions, thinking that I think non-Chinese speakers and readers might benefit from hearing directly from Chinese analysts or journalists or policymakers what the Chinese position on a growing environmental crisis and what the position on climate was, but also that their Chinese equivalents would benefit from speeding up a learning process, learning, for instance, about the experience from elsewhere. We've all had industrial revolutions. We've all had to clean up the mess. And by reporting and translating that for them, we hope that we might just speed the process along and create the basis for cooperation that climate change is going to need.
It's terrific to have you, and coming in from London, no less, if I understand right, or at least England.
It's London.
Next, we've got Clay Stranger. He's the founding project manager of Reinventing Fire China at the Rocky Mountain Institute, among other things. Clay, you want to give us a little bit of your background?
Sure. Thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me today, and good afternoon from Colorado, everyone. My name's Clay Stranger, and I'm a project manager at Rocky Mountain Institute. And for the last about 3.5 years, I've been helping lead an effort to chart a clean energy pathway for China that costs no less and ideally provides some net present value benefit to the Chinese economy while utilizing the largest cost-effective and technically feasible share of energy efficiency technologies and renewable or low-carbon supply. We set out to do this 2.5 years ago in partnership with the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in the United States and with the Energy Research Institute of China's National Development and Reform Commission. So it was, in essence, a little bit of analytic diplomacy in building out this model and working across the two governments and having Energy Foundation China and Rocky Mountain Institute, both nonprofit organizations involved, was quite interesting. I have just the 3.5 years of experience working on this project of China experience, but I'm certainly happy to be here, share a little bit of what we found in the report that'll be released later this month, and learn from the rest of distinguished folks on this panel. Thank you.
Great to have you, I think, coming in from Colorado. Next, we've got Barbara Finnemore. She's the Asia Director at the National Resources Defense Council, and again, has a long background in the space. You want to tell us a little bit more about yourself? Oops, you're muted right now. You just got to unmute.
Thank you so much, Peter and Mark. It's an honor to be here with such a distinguished panel. And in terms of my background, I have been working on climate and clean energy and environmental issues in China for about 25 years. And 20 years ago, I started the China program of the Natural Resources Defense Council. NRDC was the first NGO to launch a clean energy program in China. And now we have about 40 people in our Beijing office, and we are working at every level in China with the central government, provinces, cities, universities, NGOs, lawyers, and judges to help China peak its CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions much earlier than its commitment at the Paris Agreement, and through things such as helping China to cap and decrease its use of coal, which is responsible for 80% of China's climate emissions, to boost its energy efficiency in buildings and in industry, to scale up renewable energy and electric vehicles on the grid, to promote sustainable urbanization, and to strengthen China's environmental law and governance. So I'm delighted to be here today.
It's great to have you. We got Deborah Seligsohn as well, environmental governance researcher at UC San Diego, and she's been focusing on air pollution regulation in China and India, among other things, in her background. Give us a little bit more.
Hi, Peter, and thanks for inviting me here today. Yes, I first went to China back in 1984, so I think not quite as early as Isabel, but I've lived in China now close to 18 years over that 30-some-year period, and have really focused on a lot on the U.S. China relationship for that entire time. I served at the U.S. Embassy twice, including as science counselor in Beijing, as well as at the U.S. Consulate in Guangzhou. And then when I left the State Department, I served as principal advisor to the World Resources Institute when it set up its China Climate and Energy Program. WRI is a think tank that focuses on big global issues, including being a real leader in climate change thinking. I then decided to try to get to real root causes of what causes environmental change in this world, and decided to go back to school and get a PhD. And so that's why I'm talking to you from San Diego today. I'm at UC San Diego working on a PhD looking at the incredible change we've seen in environmental regulation in China. I think few people know that air pollution in China actually peaked in 2011 and has been dropping steadily from a very high point, but dropping steadily since. So we're still seeing real progress, and understanding how progress takes place within the context of an authoritarian state is really something we don't understand, and what I'm working on now.
It's fantastic to have you here. So now we're to Mark. Mark, take over, drive a good conversation, and looking forward to seeing what you pull off here.
Well, thank you very much. Thank all of you. It's a terrific panel. We have just a depth of expertise that is pretty much unparalleled. Let me just spend a minute or two giving people a bit of the framework and the context. It was only 18 months ago, during Barack Obama's visit to Beijing, that the U.S. and China signed a landmark environmental agreement. And the key point, to me perhaps the most important, was that for the first time China put itself on record as committing itself to see emissions of greenhouse gas emissions peak around 2030, quote unquote, around 2030. Now that was only 18 months ago, and yet it was seen as a huge breakthrough. Before that, people I knew in Hong Kong who were doing this policy work thought it might be well after 2030 that China peaked. And the importance of China and the U.S. in not only seeing greenhouse gas emissions peak, but actually fall, and fall dramatically over the next couple of decades, really can't be overestimated. In very, very rough terms, these two economies account for about half of total greenhouse gas emissions globally. China's the biggest, 30% or so. So just 18 months ago, this was big news, and yet, as Barbara suggested, China can peak much earlier. I think the work that Clay and others at Rocky Mountain Institute are doing also suggests that. Some of what Deborah is doing also points that direction. So we have come so far in this last 18 months from thinking that a 2030 promise was a huge breakthrough to now thinking, and actually knowing, of course, that 2030 is not nearly early enough in terms of seeing China's emissions peak, and that China can and perhaps will see emissions peak earlier. In fact, there's some suggestions they might already be near peak emissions now, and then we have to start moving to drive those emissions down very quickly. Now that's on the Chinese side. I think Orville will get us in, and others, and Deborah will get us, and Barbara will get us into some of the bilateral issues. But I'd like perhaps one of you to extend on what I've just said over the last couple minutes and give us a sense of where we've come in the last 18 months, because it started with Obama's visit and the agreement in November, but of course it went through, as several people mentioned, the Paris agreement in December, where China reaffirmed and put those promises in a multilateral context. So, I don't know, Orville, would you like to pick up and give us a little more sense of the context?
Well, thanks, Mark. You know, I think for those of us who've been toiling in these vineyards a long time, the most sort of promising thing that can be said is that, you know, it wasn't so many years ago that China didn't really recognize its interest in climate change. And indeed, when I think I started getting into this 10, 15 years ago, there was some circumspection in China that perhaps the whole climate change argument was something of a plot just to slow down China's economic development. And I think what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years particularly is a recognition that they actually do have a dog in this fight, that they actually do have a real interest in remedying this problem. And of course, without that, we would really not have anything. So the second thing I think is worth saying, that if you put this in the context, as I think we must, of the larger relationship of China's connection to the world and to the United States, I think it's sort of interesting to divide it up into sort of a double entry manner. And look at all those things where China does share with the United States and Europe in particular, and other developed countries, something that they recognize as a common interest. And here, I think climate change is very promising. I think actually nuclear proliferation is another area of some potential promise, because there's a lot of concern in China. I think things like food safety, pandemics, these things, there is a recognized interest. Now, later in the conversation, we can get into the other column, and that's the column where there is much contention, much disagreement, and I think, sadly, now, even more possibility for real conflict if not managed properly. So the question in my mind is the great progress that we've made in the question of climate change, is it in a sense strong enough, powerful enough? Can it build enough musculature between the two countries to actually sort of steady the relationship? It would be nice. I'm a little bit dubious, but I'd be very curious to hear the reaction of others.
Deborah, I think you wanted to jump in. You had a slightly different take on the way I framed that.
Yeah, I see this as steady progress over a large number of years. I mean, I think Orville alluded to that. I mean, there's been a lot of work. And the fact that the Chinese were ready to recognize when peaking would occur sort of publicly and internationally fits in with a general trend that the Chinese really only make international commitments when they're absolutely confident of them. So this has been talked about for quite a long time in China. There have been a lot of models that suggested it would be 2030. By the time they committed to 2030, plenty of people were saying it would really be much earlier, which is why the language said with best efforts to get there sooner. So I think if we go back even with the U.S. and China, I mean, we had these landmark announcements prior to Copenhagen where first, I can't remember now the order, but both China and the U.S. a day apart announced their targets for Copenhagen around Thanksgiving of 2009. Then Copenhagen itself went very badly. I think the Chinese learned an enormous amount from Copenhagen and have handled their PR around these big meetings so much better ever since. And certainly Xi Jinping's incredible confidence, which can be challenging in many areas, was actually very, very useful in terms of Paris, because he was willing to get out there early and state his positions. He made it clear to people that he was going to be available on the phone. You know, the previous model of collective leadership had actually hampered Wen Jiabao in Copenhagen from being able to flexibly respond to changes on the ground. And what's interesting, but also somewhat disturbing, is that a more personalist authoritarian leader actually then has the flexibility to make decisions that enable these kind of agreements to be easier. So I see, in terms of sort of overall developments in China, there's a kind of glass half full, glass half empty in terms of where we are, because it fits into a larger story that doesn't make all issues that we might care about easier, but it certainly played into the sort of ease of agreement in this area. But the most important reason that things have progressed is because China's energy picture has changed so much over the years. That new energy coming online is more likely to be non-fossil than ever before, that demand is not increasing as fast, that all of the work that so many people here on this panel have done on improving energy efficiency over the years has really paid off. So the Chinese are in a much more confident space. Whether this can outweigh other tensions is a much more complicated area. I will say that one of the things I felt when I was science counselor is that the U.S. China science relationship overall, not just on climate and environment issues, but on all scientific issues, is one of the real sort of ballasts of the relationship that holds through and gives support to the relationship kind of through thick and thin, and can really support not only people to people, but government to government relations, even when there are other areas of significant tension.
Barbara, do you want to pick up on some of the points? And then perhaps Isabel, I know I'd like to bring in your perspective, because, particularly because you're outside of the U.S., you're outside of China, right? Barbara?
Well, having been at Copenhagen, I fully agree with Debbie that the relations, the poor relations between the U.S. and China on climate issues was a key sticking point in the difficulties that everybody had in reaching an agreement. And since that time, not just in the last 18 months, but starting immediately after Copenhagen, I went to a conference in China on how the U.S. can help China report and control and manage its greenhouse gas emission data. This monitoring, reporting, and verification was one of the key sticking points in the negotiations, but behind the scenes, the U.S. and China were quietly working together to build China's capacity. And so that has become, I think, one of the key reasons why agreement was able to be reached in Paris, is because China felt confident in its ability to not only control its greenhouse gas emissions, but to monitor and report them. And so, yes, I think there's actually been 3 agreements in the last 18 months. There was the September 2014 agreement, when the 2 countries made their initial climate pledges. Then there was another one in September of 2015, when China and the U.S. got much more specific on areas that they would work together. And this includes, and the third one was March of this year, when Xi Jinping came to the U.S. and both countries agreed that they would not only sign the Paris Agreement on the first day that it was open for signature, but even more important, pledged to formally ratify the agreement as best, to the best of their ability by the end of this year, which is going to be an enormous boost in getting the agreement to enter into force. But yes, that's been an acceleration of effort, but there are behind the scenes some major U.S.-China climate-related bilateral agreements that are going great guns. One of them is this U.S.-China climate change working group that had 2 purposes. One, to bring together experts on about 7 or 8 different areas, ranging from heavy-duty vehicles to smart grid to climate change in forest to monitoring, reporting greenhouse gas emissions, most recently low carbon cities, and so forth. This working group is moving ahead very fast. They keep on adding new groups. So that is a very, very vital area of ongoing collaboration between the 2 countries. That climate change working group had another feature, which was an enhanced dialogue on climate, which was like a behind-the-scenes track 2 discussions that were ongoing between the official climate negotiators on a regular basis. And I think that helped to build trust between the 2 organizations and to try to find common grounds on a lot of the sticking points in the international negotiations. Another major area of cooperation between the 2 countries is quite interesting. It's called the U.S. China Clean Energy Research Center. And this one has just been renewed by the 2 countries for another 5 years and given additional funding. And its purpose is to bring researchers together from both countries to work on 3 concrete issues: building energy efficiency, electric vehicles, and carbon capture and sequestration. And most interestingly, they've developed a protocol for the researchers to share the intellectual property from their joint research, which is a first as far as I understand. NRDC is a member of the Building Efficiency Clean Energy Research Center. We're the only NGO. This is led by the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, but includes many, many companies as well as researchers doing the research and sharing that intellectual property. And I have to say, it's a very, very promising effort. So yes, I think it's a combination of steady progress over the years, since China did begin, as Orville said, to recognize that tackling climate change is in its own interest, whether it be because China's own scientists now say that China is one of the countries most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So they recognize that it's in their own interest for energy security issues as well, and also, of course, to drive air pollution. So it's a combination of steady progress and also an accelerated effort over the last 3 years as the two countries have found that common ground. And now the point is they've made their commitments. What they both want to see is the action taken domestically to carry them out.
Great, thank you. Isabel?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add. I agree with I agree with these points. I just wanted to add a couple of things. To Orville's point about China recognizing late that climate change mattered, that it had a dog in the fight. I think that's absolutely true, but I think China's known for a fair bit that it is vulnerable in the way Barbara has just described. I think what perhaps became more evident was that there was a very large opportunity piece here, because and that was to do with China's own economic trajectory and the fact that the old heavy industrial model was breaking down, was exhausted, and that China was going to have to find something new to do to earn a living. It was going to have to move up the value chain. It was going to have to, have a more sophisticated technological base for its domestic economy, but also for export. It was going to have to get more efficient if it was going to continue, get through that barrier that it's pretty much at the moment of trying to make that transition. So if you were looking at the world, if you were a long-term planner and you were looking at the world and thinking, what are the technologies that are really going to matter in, as the 21st century evolves? Well, low-carbon technologies are, an open space that China could occupy with its combination of a terrific manufacturing ability and an increasingly sophisticated scientific and technological sector. And so China did pretty much decide, as far as I can see, that this was going to be their opportunity. And I think that maybe that's not quite as well understood outside China as it might be. So when you look at how long-term and how serious is this commitment, it is a strategic commitment. So the question you might ask is whether they can, and I'm sure we'll get onto this, whether this commitment can be realized. But I think that in terms of the seriousness of the commitment, it's pretty strong. Why then did it only show up in terms of peaking emissions 2 years ago? Well, I think it helps to look back at the disaster that was Copenhagen, that has been mentioned already, and look at how dysfunctional really the international process was up to and including Copenhagen. Remember at that point that the world was divided into Annex I countries and non-Annex I countries, and what that meant was a division between advanced economies, industrial and post-industrial societies, which were legally obliged to take action on climate change, and developing or emerging economies, which included China, which were not legally obliged. Now, the two biggest emitters were somehow not in the game, because the United States, you may recall, had not ratified the Kyoto Protocol, had not accepted its legal obligations. And even now, the United States takes its baseline as 1995, whereas everybody else takes 1990, so there's a bit of a free pass in there for 5 years. And China was not committed, not legally obliged to peak its emissions or to set a date for peaking its emissions. So all this build-up that China was doing in terms of working on its energy efficiency, in terms of developing its new sectors in renewables and so on, did not show up in the climate negotiations, because you don't put anything on the table unless you have to. These negotiations functioned pretty much like trade negotiations, in that everybody goes in the room looking to get as much as they can and give away as little as they can. And what that meant was that it really didn't work. When you come to Paris, you have a completely different situation where everybody brings and pledges, there's a review, it doesn't give us enough, but there isn't this kind of toxic, you're not doing enough, and this tendency to use the other's failures in your own domestic politics. So in the United States, you hear voices saying, why should we do this? China's the biggest emitter, they're not doing anything. And in China, people saying very legitimately, look at the per capita carbon footprint of the United States, look at us, we still have big poor areas. This was a conversation that was going nowhere, and that was what we got past in Paris. And thanks, honestly, in great measure to the diplomacy of the French, and that liberated both sides, it seems to me, to engage in this extremely constructive conversation that begins with this announcement. China commits to a peaking date, and we all know that it's a very elastic one. They ought to be able to peak much, much earlier. And the United States and China can build on a cooperative framework with much less risk of it going toxic. And that's absolutely critical.
Terrific. That's a great summary, I think, and a really good bridge into looking forward a little bit. So let me turn it over to Clay and talk about what are some practical steps we can look at moving forward, both on the U.S. side but especially on the Chinese side.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and Isabel. Thanks for your comments there. I think the balance between sort of action out of enlightened self-interest versus international commitment or pressure is an interesting one, and I think both have held influence in the process of arriving where we are now post-Paris. I did want to just tell a really brief story that was from a couple years ago when we were just launching the Reinventing Fire China project, and we'd had sort of the launch event, and we were underway with the analysis, and we hosted a dinner for some of the senior officials from the Chinese government that were advising the project. And one of them stood up in his toast and said, there are many issues that our two countries disagree about. And he was speaking about the U.S. and China. And he said, and there will always be many issues that our countries disagree about, and that's okay. Cooperating on clean energy, on climate, and on energy efficiency issues is not one of them. And it's vital to the security and the prosperity of both our nations and the world that this cooperation go forward. So hearing those words, then several weeks later being with Rocky Mountain Institute's founder, Amory Lovins, in the Pentagon, and we described the project to a group of 2- and 3-star admirals, and one of them stood up and said nearly the identical thing. And he said, we spend most of our days dealing with issues between the U.S. and China in cyberspace and in the South China Sea. He's like, but when it comes to clean energy, when it comes to climate change, it's vital that both of our nations cooperate. So hearing that alignment between the U.S. Department of Defense on the one hand and the Chinese National Development and Reform Commission on the other, I think was positive, and it gave us hope that we'd get to where we have arrived now. So in terms of where China can go next, part of the effort of Reinventing Fire was to lay a pathway in which there aren't a lot of sacrifices that China has to make in terms of its overall economic performance. In fact, none whatsoever. And what we found is that by 2050, China can increase its carbon productivity by 600% and its energy productivity by 1,100% compared to 2010 levels, and do so while it grows its economy 600%. Over that 40 years. Just for a little bit of perspective, the Industrial Revolution increased labor productivity 900% in the US in 120 years. So we're talking about more transformational change in a lot of ways than the Industrial Revolution in a shorter period of time. To give an example of one of the types of solutions that we're pursuing from the Reinventing Fire work, we could look at the transportation sector, for example, and about 2/3 of energy in the transport sector is used to move heavy trucks around, pulling goods from heavy manufacturing bases out to ports, and in that whole distribution infrastructure. Unfortunately, in China, 40% of the trucks driving on the roads are what we call empty running, or literally carrying nothing but air, so creating no value but emitting lots of pollution and lots of emissions. That's about double the level of empty running that we find in the US or the EU. And there's a number of reasons for that. It's a very fragmented industry. many, I think up to 50% or 60% of drivers are single truck driver owner operators, so you don't have big fleets to leverage or take advantage of. But at the same time, the logistics and the freight markets are really broken and fairly primitive. And so we're working to develop online location-based service Uber-like apps for freight logistics in China. And the Chinese government, especially in Shenzhen, where we're piloting this, has bought in and are in fact leading it now. And if we can have that empty running number from 40% down to Western levels of about 20%, that's 100 megaton a year carbon savings opportunity if deployed across China. So it costs almost nothing. It's more of an in the cloud or online platform that would streamline matching drivers with loads and getting them back to their families as quickly as possible, making them happy, earning them more money, and creating value for the economy, and pulling significant amount of emissions out of the economy. Those are the types of solutions and levers that we're looking to develop, and there's a whole host of them across all different energy sectors.
That's terrific, and you'll be releasing this detailed study within the next month or so, I guess.
Yeah, it should come out at the end of this month, at the end of May.
That's terrific. And Barbara, I think you wanted to jump in with some points along this line?
Yes, thank you, Mark. There are a couple of other immediate steps that the U.S. and China can take that would have enormous impact. And all of these I'd just like to highlight beyond the climate Paris commitments. Were ones that the two countries have already agreed to work together on. And one of them is to work together under another international agreement, the Montreal Protocol, to reduce emissions of a super greenhouse gas called hydrofluorocarbons that is, hundreds of times more potent than CO2. And India is another important partner in this effort. The two countries have agreed to do that. Countries are getting closer on that agreement, but reaching an agreement to limit and control HFCs would be a really important step. Another step is that, as you know, China is going to host the G20 meeting this September in Hangzhou, and one of the things that the two countries have agreed to work on is to find ways, and the other G20 countries too, is to find ways to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. So really making good on that promise, which was actually something the G20 agreed to quite some time ago, would be an enormous step forward. Third, China and the U.S. agreed to limit public finance for high carbon emitting projects overseas. And this is particularly important for China to carry through on with its One Belt, One Road Marshall Plan for investment in countries, 40 different countries overseas. This could be a real negative trend for the climate if that investment goes into things like more coal-fired power plants, even if China itself is moving to rein in its coal-fired power plants and its reliance on coal. And finally, the two countries agreed in March to work together to limit find a way to limit greenhouse gas emissions from the aviation sector. Emissions from aviation and shipping were a glaring omission in the Paris Agreement. So we're pretty heartened that the two countries see potential for common interest there. But moving ahead on all these commitments is something that's going to be really important going forward.
Right, and I'm glad we're into this, looking at what's being done to deepen the relationship and really scale up the impact of what's happening. But we've spent a lot of time talking about China. Deborah, would you like to give us a little bit of a perspective on the U.S. and the U.S.'s responsibility?
Well, in the September agreement between the U.S. and China, while China committed to peaking and all the other things that we've talked about, including an emissions trading system, the U.S. committed to implementing the President's Clean Power Plan, which is now bogged down in the courts and has actually been stayed. And I think one of the things we forget is that the U.S. is actually not a model for really active and rapid action on climate change. And Isabel is laughing, I can see in my window, because certainly a number of countries in Europe have been pushing the U.S. pretty hard for quite a long time. So I think there's a real problem in constantly talking about what the U.S. can do to push China. The reality is we also need to figure out how to use the work we do with China to learn for our own purposes. There's a lot of synergy in areas from solar power development to nuclear power development, where we should be taking the technological lessons that we learn from working with China and applying them back in the United States. We also need to be pushing pretty hard domestically to just get the good ideas that we already have, including the President's Clean Power Plan, actually implemented and get beyond the many, many political hurdles that we have in the U.S. So I just think that we need to keep some balance, because the United States is still a much, much larger per capita emitter of greenhouse gases, as well as the second largest absolute emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. While the world cannot solve climate without China, equally, the world cannot solve climate until the U.S. solves its own problem.
Yeah, good point. Orville, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously, the U.S. has to be a player in this, and we all are painfully aware of our own compromised state of grace when it comes to being a full-fledged partner. I'd say particularly Washington is having trouble. I think, though, that it would behoove us to look to some of the states and cities in our country where there's some actually very interesting things being done toward the state of California. One part of this puzzle which worries me greatly on the Chinese side, however, is this. I think we do have a keen sense from listening to everybody who's spoken today of the absolutely essential and elemental role that American NGOs, particularly environmental NGOs, and the government to some extent as well, has played in sort of helping to forge this partnership with China and build a really constructive and meaningful relationship. The new civil society law in China, which I'm sure you and many of our listeners are aware of, is very troublesome from this perspective. Because if you look at the U.S. China relationship, it seems to me that one of the great virtues of the way American society is constructed is that when governments have trouble, which they often do because they have to deal with all manner of problems, civil society organizations, which tend to be more specific, they do the environment, they do law, they do women, they do whatever, can move into the breach. And they serve as a kind of a flotation device for this relationship. And so we find that over the years that in the question of environment and climate change, civil society has played a role that cannot be overemphasized. But with the new civil society law that has a tendency to look at foreign NGOs rather suspiciously, even in a paranoid manner, now sort of coming to the fore, it's not too clear whether we're going to be able to maintain this very helpful, constructive form of civil society relationship, which has meant so much to our ability to be optimistic about climate change, and also to stabilizing the U.S.-China relationship so it isn't completely rocked by the South China Sea and Tibet and other issues like that, of sort of big state-to-state, big nation-to-nation power wrangling.
Great. Let me turn to Isabel and then to Barbara to address, they're both involved with NGOs, to address these issues.
Well, I agree with Orville that this is a very worrying development, and the law has only just, in its final form, been approved. So we have very, very little idea how it will be applied. And Chinese laws tend to be imprecise, and they leave a lot of leeway for applications. So I think that this is all pretty unfortunate as a development, but it does reinforce what I also feel about the U.S.-China relationship, is that we don't have a lot of time to address climate change. This is really urgent if we're going to get to 2 degrees let alone 1.5. We have to be moving as fast and across a broader spectrum of activity as we possibly can. Now, as Barbara said, the relationship between Xi Jinping and Obama was pretty important in keeping things on track in Paris. So I think that the vulnerabilities of the present arrangements are that there's an election coming up in the United States. We don't know what will happen. President Trump could really derail everything. And Xi Jinping, although he looks very powerful, is also facing, there's going to be another big party meeting next year. He's going to have to refresh the standing committee, the Politburo, and the party is such a black box. We really don't know how his power extends. So we have a vulnerability there in that we've got two very important leaders with a clearly quite functional conversation going on this. So it's very, very important that this relationship be built across as wide a base as possible, city to city. I know a lot of this is going on, and it really, really is important, because if the state-to-state, government-to-government relationship should falter for any reason, it is terribly important that the cooperation on a practical level, on the kind of self-interested lower levels of government, continue to function. And I very much hope that can happen. Because, my big worry in general about climate change is that the world is very easily distracted by other things, like the financial crisis in 2009, which knocked it off everybody's concerns. We don't have time to waste at this point. So the more broad-based and robust this relationship can be, and I regret that the complications that the INGO law is going to give to international NGOs in China. But let's hope that other entities can continue to build this relationship.
Yeah, thanks. Barbara, the Natural Resources Defense Council's had a long-standing and very large presence on the ground in China. How's that changing, and what do you expect looking forward, particularly as a result of this law?
Well, we've been anticipating this new NGO law for some time. There was a draft issued for public comment last year. The final version is a little bit better, but again, it leaves a lot of room for interpretation. As Isabel said, we're not clear how it's going to apply, but it's definitely going to apply to organizations such as mine. And I think what it reflects is that the Chinese government doesn't recognize what the U.S. government has come out publicly in stating its support for continued strong NGO engagement in China. And it is, as Orville mentioned, the essential role that NGOs such as NRDC play in actually not just our own efforts, but in supporting and extending and expanding the work of the national to central government relationships, state to state agreements, city to city agreements. I mean, my very first project in Beijing was actually suggested by an assistant U.S. Secretary of Energy to his Chinese counterpart in the late 90s. Let's build a demonstration green building. But what happened then, and what happened, and I've seen this happen in the last 20 years in China, is the U.S. government didn't have any money to carry out that project. There's so much turnover in the government. NGOs have the ability to have a long-term view and to build up that expertise and relationship and continue to work on issues for many, many years. So we volunteered to be the project manager for that first green building in China, the first LEED certified green building in China. And we have been, essential in, we actually catalyzed the first state to province agreement on climate in China, which was between California and its sister province, Jiangsu. I think if I could leave any message behind with the Chinese government, it is to think more carefully about the essential role that NGOs have played in China and do continue to play in other countries, and to not strangle that in its application of this new NGO law.
It's nice to hear the optimism. I think that Orville's pessimism sounds like it's sort of really winning the day. It's good to be optimistic looking forward, but it's really pretty hard in this environment. So let me, Deborah, if I can turn it over to you. I mean, you talked about the virtues, I guess, of decision making in an authoritarian environment. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the NGO law will be applied pretty harshly, and it will move in an increasingly authoritarian direction in China. What's the impact of that?
So I want to disassociate myself from the term virtues of an authoritarian.
I'm sorry. So but you said it can have a certain effectiveness.
Sometimes people are overly attracted to the effectiveness. I think every time we complain about American gridlock, we have to remember the alternative. So yeah, I think that I would actually even like to take a step back further and think about what the Chinese have ever thought that foreign NGOs were doing in China, because I don't think they ever saw them as representatives of civil society. I think they've always seen them as representatives of some specific sets of interests or expertise. And where they have welcomed foreign NGOs, it's because they wanted the involvement of those specific groups or that specific expertise. I think Barbara's example of the Green Building and of the active engagement of the Green Buildings Council in that work that she did is classic, in that the Chinese wanted to learn how to build green buildings, and they've learned a great deal from that. A lot of the work that we did when I was at World Resources Institute was on something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which was a methodology to the management of a great deal of greenhouse gas emissions from heavy industry. So I suspect what they want to do with this law, because actually these laws now go back more than a decade. The Chinese have been trying to figure out how to draft various NGO management laws, is they want to be able to pick and choose, right? So I don't think we're going to see it implemented uniformly with equal strictness. They would prefer to see environmental NGOs bringing environmental expertise, but they're not so crazy about human rights NGOs working with human rights activists, right? So I think if our concern is about the environment, I think we really have to have a wait-and-see attitude on how it's going to affect environmental groups, especially for the air pollution. It may not have that big an effect. Groups working with local activists opposing specific projects or opposing, for example, dam construction may find it much more constraining. Groups that work directly with human rights activists, I think, are going to find this law really tough. So I think that's a larger picture, and that picture definitely has a great deal to do with an interest in Xi Jinping and other people high in the Chinese government. Li Keqiang is someone who I remember directly telling us when I was working at the U.S. government, look, on the AIDS issue, this is our problem, and the government can solve it. And he was not persuaded that NGOs that were really critical in that effort were all that important. So I think we're going to see a lot of variety. I mean, that's typically what we see with Chinese implementation. I would agree that it's not like a really optimistic sign, but it's also not particularly surprising given the nature of the authoritarian state.
Great. I think those are good points. Orville, let's go back to you, since you sort of started this and you've been writing a lot about this issue. I mean, could this really derail the whole effort on the environmental side? I mean, how worried should we be?
Well, I think Debbie's right that there'll be certain things which are more technical and more scientific that probably will have a fair passage. But I think we have to be realistic that at least the way civil society organizations have worked in environmental questions in the U.S. and Europe and elsewhere in democratic countries is that they not only provide technical know-how, but they criticize governments and they support governments. And perhaps most delicate of all in China's case, they deal with the media. They build a mass base through education and through sort of intercession and media outlets. So this is unfortunately where this sweet alliance that we've been discussing between the U.S. and China and climate change could run into some really significant problems. And I'm sorry to say that I think the shoal upon which it could founder is one which we often try to avoid because it's so insoluble, and that is that the U.S. and China have very different political systems and very different values. So the very idea of a civil society organization upon which we, our environmental movement, has been so dependent, and which in a certain sense is the model for so much of what foundations and think tanks and NGOs have done in China, it doesn't quite, there's a clash with the sort of fundamental assumptions of the way China is put together politically. So this is a very vexing, very troublesome, and kind of a discontinuity that makes it not entirely easy for one to be optimistic about the future, particularly with this new law.
Thanks. Let me turn it over to Isabel.
Yeah, I would just add to what Orville just said that one of the major functions of NGOs elsewhere, including the United States, is to tackle whatever the vested interest is that's blocking progress in their thing. Now that might be a government, it might be a political party, it might be a major fossil fuel company in this case. China has those vested interests too. And there was a point, a few years ago where there were officials in the Chinese state machine, particularly in the Ministry of Environmental Protection, who saw a very effective alliance between a relatively weak ministry and an emergent civil society, which would function in the way that Orville described. And they together put through very important regulations on the right to know, on transparency, on accountability, on all those things that you need to make policy work. Now, my concern about the general direction now is that I think those spaces are closing down, and they're closing down for Chinese civil society. International civil society is, in a wait-and-see mode, waiting to see what will happen. But one of those many things that can derail or slow or delay policy and policy implementation in China as elsewhere is that kind of resistance. And if you don't have lots of antennae out and lots of organizations motivated to expose it and attack it, you're depriving yourself of a whole bunch of tools that are really very useful. And I think that's a great pity.
Let me jump in there. I think that's a very interesting point. I think we saw with Chai Ching's documentary last year, Under the Dome, was a great example of what you're talking about, Isabel, where she worked with some, I think really committed government officials who took a lot of risks. And it was interesting to see that, that got 200 or 300 million downloads in China in the 10 days or 2 weeks that it was up there. And then for whatever reason, I don't know, maybe some of you do, why it was shut down. But I would speculate that the power of these vested energy interests in China, just as in so many other countries, held the day. So I think Deborah wants to jump in with it with Under the Dome as well. So let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think we can assume that it wasn't just office director type officials that were supporting Under the Dome. It looks like the entire Ministry of Environmental Protection was supporting it, up to and including the minister. So it was actually produced under the previous minister. Office directors in any government, including when I was in the U.S. government, don't speak on camera unless the boss says okay. That just doesn't happen. So and then the current minister, Chen Jining, actually publicly endorsed the video. I think we've seen from some really excellent political science that when China shuts down conversations, it typically doesn't have to do with whether it's critical or positive toward the government. They do it in both cases if there's too much collective action, if people are grouping together, that's the political risk. So Under the Dome served an environmental purpose by getting out there, getting that information, getting 250 million views, and getting that right before the meeting of the National People's Congress. Everyone, the environmentalists, wanted to see that film, saw it. Then it got taken down, and I think that we've seen that time and again. We saw that with press coverage of the Songhua River spill back in 2005, which I think was the first galvanizing moment in the current efforts to address environmental issues. The Chinese government allowed press for 60 days and then completely shut it down. So I think that has a lot to do with political control. I don't disagree with you that oil companies and others were concerned, but I think, again, it reflects a larger concern on the Chinese government's part, that having a lot of sort of unofficial activism is not what they were looking for. And from an environmental point of view, the film's point had already been made.
Yeah, fair point. I think I'm trying to underscore Isabel's I think attention that she's drawn to the fact that we have some very powerful vested interests in China, as in so many other countries, and we know the energy industry worldwide is, and historically has always been, a very central and very powerful and one that's very closely connected with governments. And I think, to get back to the point about NGOs and civil society, when you have these other voices, you can deal with these in a different way. So I just wanted to use that as an example. And I want to turn to again look forward and ask perhaps Barbara or Orville to help us get into the sort of the final section of this discussion, which is talk a little more broadly about how critical it is for getting the U.S.-China relationship right if the world wants to avert a climate disaster. You want to jump in?
Sure. Well, China and the U.S. together are responsible for 40% of total greenhouse gas emissions. But another interesting recent study by Barclays Bank found that China itself holds the key to a 2-degree pathway, because it alone is responsible for 33 to 40% of the gap between current trends and that 2-degree pathway. So yes, indeed, where China goes, so goes the planet, and of course the U.S. as well, as we've heard before. But it's interesting. As Orville said, there are an endless number of key issues in the U.S.-China relations. I have heard from colleagues in the U.S. government not only that climate change is a bright spot, but climate change is the bright spot, and perhaps the only bright spot in U.S.-China relations at the moment. And I think going forward, I do feel somewhat confident that this will continue and grow, because I think the two countries are beginning to realize that climate change is an existential national security issue. I mean, we've already heard people talking about climate refugees. The impact of climate change on food production, on water security in China cannot be overestimated. So I think once the two countries really begin to grapple with this idea, they will continue to move forward in the right direction and find more and more common ground. And I also want to say, it's not just to avoid the negatives of climate change. Climate change and clean energy are inextricably linked, and the innovation in clean energy is a big business opportunity for both countries. And I think China sees that. I think the U.S. does as well. And I think going forward, that's only going to grow to be a larger component of that collaboration. And I just feel like, I know Orville was saying climate change is only one aspect of the relationship, but I think the one thing that could derail this U.S. China collaboration could be the tensions in all the other aspects of the relationship. And we know they're there and very serious. And if the two countries are not able to handle those, this could all fall by the wayside.
Clay, let me turn it over to you again, because you've done some really specific work on this. What does it look like going forward?
Well, one thing that I'm finding a lot of hope in is the ongoing commitment between the U.S. and China to pursue city-level cooperation on climate issues. And the National Development and Reform Commission in China has founded what they call the APPC, the Alliance of Pioneer Peaking Cities, that I mentioned earlier. And they've committed now to an annual meeting with a set of mayors from U.S. cities and governors from U.S. states to join with their Chinese counterparts to track progress, to describe best practice, and to really distill what are the key strategies that are working, that are relevant across the Pacific, what are the key strategies that are relevant within the U.S. that need scaling, how can China assemble the building blocks that already exist in many places into an integrated and comprehensive plan that allows them to deliver and ideally exceed their goals. So I think it sounds fairly basic, but that level of best practice sharing and even if it's a thin layer of accountability, the accountability that's associated with making these commitments in the presence of other city leaders and meeting annually to track them is encouraging. Specifically, I wanted to just respond to what Barbara mentioned a moment ago about the economic opportunity and actually the economic missed opportunity if China doesn't get this right. And I think many of us must have seen recently in the news there was announcements from the Chinese government that some previously authorized coal plants had been deauthorized. And I think this is largely due to the fact they're recognizing a similar conclusion we drew in our analysis, Reinventing Fire China, is that in building new coal-fired power plants right now in China, they have a maximum cost-effective operating lifetime of 8 to 12 years. And those are 50 to 65-year assets that they would be locked in and forced to depreciate should they construct them. So we did a piece of analysis specifically targeting this to say, okay, while demand is still growing, although slowing, for electricity in China, how can China avoid building pre-stranded assets in coal-fired power plants to meet while coal is still cheaper than alternatives? And what we found is that if you look at the total system costs, today, new coal-fired power plants are still less expensive than new installed capacity of either solar or wind. That won't be the case for long, and by 2025, the alternatives become cheaper than coal. So what can China do in the meantime to bridge that gap? We looked at a set of measures that are both on the demand side, on the generation side, and on the grid side. And in very brief summary, and this was detailed in depth in the Reinventing Fire China report to come out soon, on the demand side, there's a strong need for the creation of demand response markets and to capture the available energy efficiency in buildings and industry, the sort of low-hanging fruit of cost-effective energy efficiency with reasonable paybacks. On the generation side, if China just meets their existing renewable targets and is able to reduce renewable curtailment through some grid actions and actually increase the utilization of their existing coal fleet, of their efficient existing coal fleet, and decrease the utilization and the capacity of their inefficient coal plants, that then they're able to build a little bit of new transmission to connect renewables where necessary, expand dispatch regions to allow for the intermittency and variability of solar and wind. And lastly, and I think most importantly from the grid side, creating markets that reward flexible grid assets. And that's something that RMI has been doing a lot of work on recently. But a colleague of mine, Jamie Mandel, recently coined the term flexiwatt. And a flexiwatt is a watt of electricity that you're able to use flexibly based on your convenience and when you can generate it yourself or when during peak solar or wind hours. And what we found in Hawaii is that customers can actually pull about 75% of their household electricity use under peak solar hours through smart appliances that can deploy flexiwatts. Doing a similar thing in China has gigawatt and gigaton scale saving of energy and carbon.
Interesting, great perspective. Orville, let me flip it back to you to give us a little broader take on the whole Sino-U.S. relationship, next steps, the importance of climate in solving the global problem, and of course in the bilateral relationship.
Well, I think one thing that is somewhat hopeful, and it's not exactly clear though that it will sort of prevail, is this idea that we don't have to hold one issue hostage to another in the relationship. In other words, we can continue military-to-military relations even if the U.S. sells arms to Taiwan, that even if we're having trouble in the South China Sea, we can keep going on climate change. Now, I would think that, you know, Obama is a bit of getting to be a lame duck president, but actually there's certain virtues in being a lame duck. One of the virtues is that you're looking at your legacy and you can sort of do what you want. And he's kind of decided more or less that climate change is an important issue to him. One might wonder why he wouldn't launch some sort of a last-minute urgent action effort. Appoint some very senior ambassador, sort of a shuttle diplomat, if you will, and himself possibly lead a big trip to China whose main focus is climate change. Take all the governors, take all the mayors, take all the businessmen, go there and say, listen, this is really important. We're doing a lot of interesting things. There's a lot of pieces on the board. Let's try to all bring them together, and let's also use this issue where we agree as a kind of highly symbolic representation of the fact that the U.S. does share some common interest with China. So I think there are some things that could be done. What I fear is that there's sort of a dish of loose sand. There are all kinds of very interesting things going on, but they're all quite vulnerable to other larger and somewhat more tension-laden issues in the relationship. So I think this is a great time for Obama, if climate change is something he really wants, and he knows he's not going to get it from Congress, to really ask himself, what else could he do that's both symbolic, functional, and could leave something of a bigger monument behind in the U.S.-China relationship.
Interesting ideas. So take a big sort of moonshot approach on a Big Bang approach, or Obama goes to China. Barbara and Deborah, you've both worked in government. Isabel, you've looked at it from outside a lot. Anybody want to jump in here? Barbara, I see you're ready to go.
Yeah. To build on what Orville just said, which I think is a fantastic idea, one of the really astounding and hopeful features of the Paris agreement was the 11,000 commitments made at the subnational level by cities, by regions, by companies, by civil society. And so that is so important, I think, in keeping the U.S.-China relationship on track, and also in moving forward on climate change, because it's not just a government-to-government or national government to central government issue. It requires the action, the commitments, the fulfillment of those commitments by all of these stakeholders. And so that is what I feel is the major next step for people involved in listening to this podcast, is to find ways to get involved yourselves in your city's activities, in your company's efforts to reduce its carbon footprint, to reduce your own carbon footprint, to support the efforts of those who are working to strengthen the U.S.-China relationship, to help China accelerate its climate change efforts. I can just tell you a story here about how important California's role has been to China. I just came back from China 2 weeks ago, and we brought a team of experts, including a fellow from the California Air Resources Board with 10 years experience in enforcing California's efforts to control air pollution from international ships. And China has just announced its own regulations that it is going to also require ships to switch to low sulfur fuel while at berth in every key port starting next year. Shanghai was the first, the biggest port in the world, decided they were going to start on April 1st of this year. So we brought this team to Shanghai and had a workshop and really shared this expert from CARB shared very concrete tips with the Chinese Maritime Safety Administration on how to enforce these new laws. And this, of course, as you know, enforcement has been a key, sticking point of every climate and clean energy and environmental regulation in China. But we got a very good reception there, and less than 2 weeks later, the Shanghai government actually caught the first ship that was violating its new regulations using the exact tips they had just learned from California. So again, this shows something that you might not expect to be a part of U.S. China relations, but it is a very, very important. Sharing best practices on enforcement, sharing best policies, sharing best technologies between the two countries. There's room in there for people at every level and with every stakeholder to get involved.
Great story. Deborah?
So, I mean, the U.S. and China have been working on these issues now for well over 25 years, right? The 7 and picture 20 years gone. 8 years. I can't tell whether
you're
really confused.
I think, Mark, I think we're going to have to shift.
Isabel, why don't we flip over to you?
Sure. Could I just while Deborah's bandwidth is catching up, I'd like to make a couple of points. One that, on climate, the European Union was, I think, till a few years ago, on a pretty forward position. But Europe is really not playing that role anymore, and so I think, for all sorts of reasons, it's, it has many troubles right now, and a lack of leadership, I think, on this issue. So it makes it all the more important that the United States is able to pick up the slack, and China. And I think that just, if you look at the climate relationship, and it is part of a broader relationship, and things can go wrong in that broader relationship and destabilize this. But if you look at what climate entails, it is a long list. So it's science, innovation, trade, security, industrial policy, just about everything, energy policy, geostrategic issues. If you can build a solid collaboration across that piece, you have a pretty solid foundation, and it might be strong enough to resist the accidents and the unexpected events that could otherwise derail this nervous, frankly, relationship between the US and China. And I think one of the keys to that, I think it was Barbara who said that she thought that climate change was also understood in the United States as opportunity, but I think maybe not as widely understood as it is in China. And certainly in Europe that's the case. It's tended to be seen as, the kind of the fear of sacrifice, what will we lose? And I find that in the US too. I think if we can turn that perception around, you might really have a genuine win-win. China talks about win-win, though it doesn't always convince. This really could be a genuine win-win, and those are the most robust relationships.
I think that's a terrific point, and I just want to underscore what you said, Isabel, from the work that I've done on my book and subsequently. China really does see it as an opportunity. There's still people who think, oh, we're going to have to sacrifice, we can't afford to do this yet. But increasingly, the understanding is that the economics are there. As Barbara said, terrific business opportunity. Here's China that didn't even make its first wind turbine until the turn of the century, has many of the biggest wind turbine countries in the world. And Goldwind was the world's largest last year. Solar, the same thing, came from almost nowhere to completely dominate the industry. And so I think these aren't always particularly profitable companies, but they've transformed industries. They're transforming China. And I think as our countries and as NGOs and as businesses work together, there really is a foundation to build. So That's the optimistic side. We have sort of 5 or 10 minutes to wrap things up, so I'd like to go around to each of you and ask first, in a nutshell, are you optimistic or pessimistic going forward? But above all, what are the takeaways that you'd like people to leave this conversation with? So why don't I throw it right back to you, Isabel?
Gosh, what is it? Oh, pessimism of the spirit, optimism of the will, or the other way around. I think we can't afford to be pessimistic. This is, this is an existential moment. And however nervous we might be and however many obstacles we see, I think we just have to power on. And I think that's what I'd like people to take from this conversation is that there really is nothing more important, and it's doable. It's going to require a fantastic effort. We are talking about a massive revolution that needs to happen very quickly, that will be resisted. We have a lot to learn still. So let's not be distracted. And there are always things that can distract us, but please, let's not be distracted. And the U.S. China relationship is at the center of this.
Great. Deborah's back online again, and so Deborah, sorry we lost you for technical reasons. We were sort of asking people to give us some takeaway thoughts, but I know that you were in the middle of making some other points. So perhaps you'd like to finish with those, but then give us the takeaway thought that you'd like people to leave this conversation with, as well as, fundamentally, are you optimistic or pessimistic moving forward?
So my previous thoughts that I was thinking about was simply that, the U.S. and China has been working on these energy issues now for well over 2 decades, working on air pollution, water pollution for at least 20 years at this point. There's been incredible contributions from the nonprofit sector that we've talked a lot about here. It's also the case that the U.S. EPA has been critical in helping the Chinese figure out how to put monitors on all their power plants, and that has been a dramatic change in air pollution in China. We have the Clean Energy Research Centers that were a huge initiative of the Obama administration that now have all total had $150 million worth of joint research done between them. We have just so much that's been going on for a very long time that I think has been core to the relationship and has been central to improvements both in years where we have dramatic bilateral relationships at the presidential level and when we don't. So I think it's important to realize that there's a lot there that I don't think is actually that dependent on the sort of whether there's sort of relations at the top or not. So I think we can have a lot of confidence actually in cooperation heading forward. I also think that the wonderful thing, especially in the Chinese case, is there's an enormous amount of self-interest going on in terms of the transformation of not just their energy system, but their approach to environment in general and to dealing with pollution issues. So that we can expect to see a lot from China regardless of whether the U.S. is the prime mover pushing China. I think almost too much has been said in general in the world about the U.S. pushing China. The Chinese like to work with U.S. groups because they have a lot of expertise, they have a lot of experience, they bring good things to the table. It isn't so much about pushing the Chinese to do things they don't want to do. I think these are all things the Chinese want to do. Where I hope we also walk away thinking we need to do more is making sure we all also push the United States, because holding up our share of the effort, especially domestically, requires personal commitment. It also requires structural transformation that does require the federal government to be active in the end. Without federal changes in sort of deep regulation, this isn't going to happen. Without state and local participation, it isn't going to happen either. So we need to be pushing at all levels. and we need to be active in cooperating. But I think accepting that the Chinese are going to do things that are in their interest is fundamental to any successful program I've seen over the last 30 years.
Great points. We have to move a little more quickly here. Clay, optimistic, pessimistic, and key takeaway.
Sure, thanks a lot. So overall, I'd say I feel hopeful. I think based on the analysis that RMI and our partners conducted, we really did see that China can exceed its targets with off-the-shelf technologies and design approaches, and that really the key obstacle is in bolstering efforts to disseminate, spread, and scale solutions that already exist. I'd say that the country, China's leadership, has made great strides around reframing their development pathway, and it's clear that the GDP imperative will still exist and should still exist, but I think the recognition of the need to balance that against social and environmental concerns and benefits is clear. I think most importantly, recognizing the investment opportunity that exists to stimulate long-term, clean economic growth is an important near-term opportunity for Chinese investors, for U.S. and global investors to recognize that, in fact, climate protection need not be costly and burdensome. In many cases, it can be profitable, and where it is costly, it can be offset by profitable approaches. I think that really continuing to drive the efficiency capture through further regulatory approaches and market-based approaches is going to be important, and it really does ease and speed the way for clean supply, and that electrification really can allow China to capitalize on low-cost, low-carbon renewables while providing easy and distributed energy access. So with that, I would close and just say overall I think that the solutions exist and that the burden is on us, as Barbara pointed out, to assemble them, to spread them, to find ways that we can dig in our local governments here in the States with our partners in China, and the responsibility is all of ours.
Terrific. And over to you, Barbara.
What I'm most encouraged about is the fact that China has dropped its coal consumption for the last 2 years in a row. After a decade or more of growing over 8% a year, the coal consumption dropped. It seems to have stabilized, actually, in 2013, which is the year of the airpocalypse, and the first major effort by China to tackle its air pollution. Coal is also the leading contributor to China's air pollution. So that is a recognition in part by China that it cannot continue on its economic pathway of relying on heavy industry powered by coal and other fossil fuels to move ahead, that it has no choice but to move to a cleaner path. What I'm most worried about? That we're not moving fast enough. The climate pledges made by all the countries in Paris will not get us to a 2-degree pathway. And in the meantime, the climate threat is grave and it is growing. 15 of the last 16 years in the globe have been the warmest years on record. And the first 3 months of this year have been the hottest on record by a large margin. And scientists are starting to recognize that the melting of the Arctic ice is going to be happening a lot sooner, faster than people had anticipated, with potentially devastating impact on coastal communities from that sea level rise. So that's my takeaway, is we all have to move faster, not just China, not just the U.S., but every country and all of us.
Yeah, thank you. Final word from Orville Schell.
Well, I think, we have different political systems, different value systems, different core interests in the South China Sea. One could go on. We do happen to have, though, one very common interest, and that is the natural system in which we all live. God willing, we will come to recognize it. I do think China is moving actually a little bit more rapidly than some sectors of American society. What's my big worry? My big worry is the Chinese economy is going to hit a big bump. And when that happens, all bets are off. Maybe the coal consumption will drop, but I think it could also make it much more difficult for them to continue to remedy climate change.
Well, thank you. You've been a terrific audience. I think there is room for surprising optimism when we look closely at the work that's being done in each individual country, as well as in the relationships between U.S. and Chinese governments, NGOs, businesses. So I think the overall picture is one perhaps of guarded optimism, but I think as Isabel said, we can't afford, in a way all of you said this, we can't afford not to do this, not to get this right. As Orville says, we have a shared interest in the planet. We only have one planet. Our two countries are responsible for about half of the problem. So if we get it right, there's hope for humanity. If we don't, I guess all bets are off, as Orville said. It's good to know that there's so much going on at a granular level as well as at a strategic level between the two governments. And I think we'll try to leave on an air of perhaps guarded optimism. But it's, again, you've been a terrific panel, and it's wonderful to hear all your insights and expertise. So I'll turn it back to Pete Lyden now.
Couldn't make any further comment on what has been a fantastic conversation. Really terrific that we assembled this crew. You all were awesome. Really gave a good kind of layout of the possibilities going forward, and did leave, I think, a kind of hopeful trend. Even though you didn't have to be hopeful, I think it came through in this. And we thank you all for joining us. So thank you very much, and we'll see you another time.